Hey folks, it's time for the quote of the day, and for today's quote, I'm going to be answering a question that I have received a few times. And that is, why do I quote philosophers? Why do I seem to put so much weight on philosophers for the quote of the day? And I think this is an important question to answer. And if you'll give me some time, I will explain it. I think that it's important because I think people need to understand this. A lot of people don't really understand what philosophy is. They don't really understand the purpose of it. And so I'm going to try in a very, very short video here. 10 minutes is not enough time for me to tell you what philosophy is for, but I'm going to try to break it down in the easiest way possible using essentially the words of another man. Today we're quoting a philosopher, obviously. His name is Walter Kaufmann. Now, he's a relatively modern philosopher. I think he died in 1980. So he lived from 1921 to 1980, and he was born in Germany. And so he's born in Germany. He decides that he's going to be he kind of doesn't like Christianity, so he throws off Christianity and becomes a Jew in Germany. Pretty much the worst possible time in history to do that. And because of that, because he is now a German Jew, he has to leave the country, so he has to leave the country. He comes to America, and he ends up enlisting, becoming a U.S. citizen, enlisting, and going back to Germany as a translator to help fight against that particular regime. So that gives you an idea of a little bit about his life. He came back. He went to Harvard and Princeton and stuff, and studied philosophy, and ended up becoming a relatively influential philosopher. Now, what makes him influential is really, I mean, he wrote a lot of things, he said a lot of things, but one book in particular, it's called The Faith of the Heretic, which I think he came out in like 1960 or 1961. And this book kind of gives a definition that a lot of people hadn't really, I mean, people had thought of it, but nobody had really framed it this way of what a philosopher really is. I'm going to explain it to you in the most basic way possible here. So don't, if you've read the book, don't come at me, because I'm trying to convey this in the most basic way I can. Think back as far as you can, as far as you know in history. And a lot of people will imagine, people in robes like Rome and shit like that. People imagine Greek, like Plato, Aristotle, things like that. People imagine that. Some people even imagine like cavemen. Okay, you got a little too far if you're imagining cavemen, but you somewhere in between there, you get a point where somebody asks the question, why are we doing this? That's the first philosopher. That's the first philosopher. The first person to ask why we are, partaking in whatever ceremony. Why are we partaking in this belief? Why do we move in this way? These are philosophers or scientists, one of the two. And philosophers from that point on are considered somewhat heretical because they are always challenging the status quo. They're always challenging the way that people think. They're always trying to change it. They're always asking, why do we think this way? Why do we behave this way? Why do we do these things? Nowadays, people turn to psychoanalysis and even some pseudosciences and spirituality and things like that to answer these questions. But philosophy has been asking and answering these questions since we had the ability to recognize time. Like literally, the human condition is one that many philosophers, not all of them wrote it down, right? Not all of them, put it in a place where people could see it, and most of them, if not all of, but maybe 1 or 2% of them, were never heard of. They were just people like you and I that said, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Why do we believe this? Why does everybody follow this? Why are we like this? What is the point of the human suffering? What is the point of us? What is love? What is happiness? What is, this is what philosophy does. This is what it's about. And so when Walter Kaufmann writes this book, he's basically putting forward the idea that throughout time, the people that have challenged the status quo are philosophers. And he backs that up multiple times throughout history. You'll find these voices, these particular people that come out of history, and they just ask the question why at the right time, and it changes everything. It changes the way that the world sees everything. That's the power of philosophy. It's not just sitting there pontificating on some, oh, I wonder this, and then just a bunch of people in robes talking to each other and, just with their one leg up. That's not what it is. That's part of it, sure. That's at one point in time, I'm sure that happened. But that's not what it is. It's questioning why? Why are things the way they are? Why do we believe the things we believe? Why do we suffer? Like, these are fundamental questions. Even why do we exist? And most philosophers understand when they start to think these things, they're probably never going to get a real concrete answer. So what they do is they try to build upon, and this is where they teach philosophy, they build upon an understanding of what other philosophers have put forward. And so that's where you get kind of schools and systems and thoughts of, oh, well, this person said this, and then this person built on this and said this about this. And it gets a little confusing and it can be daunting. And I'm not a philosopher per se. Like, nobody would call me that, but I believe that I have read enough and learned enough and listened enough to, you know, convey some of the ideas. And that's all I'm trying to do. And so when people ask me why I focus on philosophy, it's because I believe that at every level of every day, all the time, we should be asking the question, why? Why do we do the things we do? Why do we experience things the way we experience them? Why do we believe that this particular thing is the way? Why is this other thing the way? Why don't they work together? Why do we suffer? Again, and that's really goes to the quote of the day. Because I think that when you start to ask these questions, when you truly, not just like give it a moment, but when you really sit and you think about it, it leads to something. It leads to an awakening. It changes the way that you start to live your life. And I can attest to that for sure. And so when I give you the quote in just a second, I want you to think about that. I want you to understand what he's trying to say here, because it's really, really important. And I think that if you really sit and you listen and you hear it, and then you try to make it, something that is actionable in your life, then it does change things. It will actively change your life. It'll change your perception of life and therefore change your life itself. Walter Kaufmann, the philosopher, once said, "Life ceases to be so oppressive. We are free to give our own lives meaning and purpose, free to redeem our suffering by making something of it." Let me read that again. Life ceases to be so oppressive. We are free to give our own lives meaning and purpose, free to redeem our suffering by making something of it. Now, obviously, it's phrased in a strange way for some folks, but basically, if you don't understand it because of the phrasing, what he's saying here is when we live our lives for the ideals that are kind of thrust upon us, the ways that are thrust upon us, the systems that are thrust upon us, it creates an oppressive state around us. The idea of, well, you go to school, you learn your P's and Q's, and then you go get your job and you work at your job for X number of years and you make so much money, and this is not what life is. And as soon as you can start to strip away these ideas of how it is and what you're supposed to be, and start to actually dig into like what you want and who you are, and ask the questions of why we do those things. Where does this come from? Is there a reason for this? Then you start to understand that there is a purpose to life. And when you find that purpose and you can start to act upon that purpose, it frees you up in a way that you can't even begin to imagine. You let go of the oppressive bullshit of society and systems and beliefs, and you just be. And what that does is it allows you to look at your own suffering, at the people that have hurt you, at the things that have happened around you, at the suffering in this world, and try to do things that you can do with the knowledge of that suffering to change it, to grow, to build on it, to make life better, not just for yourself, but for those around you. This is the very, very heart of what philosophy is about. And this is what, not to put too fine a point on it, what I'm trying to do here is to try to teach people just enough so that you can see the world a different way. So that tomorrow when you wake up, maybe you remember a few words, and maybe it changes a choice that you have, a direction that you walk in, a way that you carry yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you make a much larger difference in this world. Happy birthday to Walter Kaufmann, the philosopher. And to the rest of you, take care of yourself. Take care of others. I'll talk to you soon.